Good afternoon. I want us to address an issue in research called hypothesis. The discussion will focus on three principal areas, namely the meaning of hypothesis, the types of hypothesis, and the characteristics of good hypothesis. Hypothesis is an important issue in research, and that is why it will be important for all of us to take sufficient time to understand what it is and also know how it is applied and even tested in research. Welcome. The term hypothesis can be understood in different ways. For instance, a hypothesis is understood as a precise and testable statement of what the researchers predict will be the outcome of the study. It is also understood as a tentative statement about the relationship between two or more variables. The concept of the term hypothesis is also defined as a specific, testable prediction about what a researcher expects will be the outcome of the study. If we look at all these definitions, what comes out is that a hypothesis is simply what a researcher assumes would be the relationship between the various variables that exist in the field. For instance, if one wants to understand the causes of crime, a researcher might want to come up with a tentative statement as what he or she assumes as the possible causes of crime. Whether the statement comes out to be true at the end of the study will depend on the type of data or the type of evidence that is adduced during the study. If the data that is collected supports the hypothesis, then the statement is held as true. But if the evidence collected disapproves the assumption, then the hypothesis is rejected. So hypothesis is simply a proposition as to the possible relationship between two variables as is assumed by the researcher. Let us now examine some of the types of hypotheses. One of the types of hypothesis is called alternative hypothesis. An alternative hypothesis is one that assumes that there is a relationship between variables being studied. That is, one variable has an effect on the other variables. It states that the results of the study are not due to chance and that they are significant in terms of supporting the theory being investigated. And an alternative hypothesis is explicitly states that the independent variable affects the dependent variable and is denoted as H1 or HA. An example of an alternative hypothesis would read that there is a significant relationship between public participation and effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects in arid and semi-arid areas in Kenya. In other words, alternative hypothesis assumes that one variable affects the other. In our case here, the assumption here is that where there is public participation, it affects how effective the water projects that are started by donors are in arid and semi-arid areas. Now, the other type of hypothesis is called null hypothesis. And a null hypothesis is one that rejects or denies the relationship between two or more variables. That is, it is a hypothesis that states that there's no relationship between variables being studied. That is, there's no relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. Null hypothesis is also understood as a negative statement of the suspected truth under inquiry and is denoted as H0. An example, if say one wishes to investigate whether there is any significant relationship between public participation and effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects in arid and semi-arid areas, there could be two possibilities, one negative and the other positive. An example there now here would be, there is no significant relationship between public participation and effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects in arid and semi-arid areas in Kenya. If we look at this and compare it to the first one affirmed that there's a relationship, or there's a significant relationship between public participation and effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects. While in null hypothesis, it is denying or rejecting the existence of such a relationship. Another type of hypothesis is called non-directional or two-tailed hypothesis. And this type of hypothesis predicts that the independent variable will have an effect on the dependent variable. And it also suggests that independent variable, however, it does not specify the direction of the effect. In other words, a non-directional hypothesis does not clarify whether the independent variable will affect the independent variable positively or negatively. It simply states that it will affect it. But as to whether it will be positive or negative, it is silent on it. For example, there will be a difference in the effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects in arid and semi-arid areas in Kenya based on the level of public participation. It is simply saying that there will be a difference in effectiveness. So like I said, that in this case, it is not telling us the direction. For instance, it does not tell us whether public participation will improve the effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects or it will undermine. So that when we talk about non-directional hypothesis or two-tailed hypothesis, it is simply a hypothesis that is telling us that something will affect the other. Independent variable will affect the dependent variable, but does not show us which way, whether it will affect it positively or negatively. Then we have what we call directional hypothesis. And a directional hypothesis is one in which the nature of the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable is clear. It is one which states the result of the study would be either positive or negative. It predicts the direction in which the change will take place, such as greater, smaller, less, more, and we denote it as H1 with either the sign for greater or the sign for less. For instance, there will be greater effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects in arid and semi-arid areas in Kenya with higher public participation. It is giving the direction that if the level of public participation is higher, then it has the potential of improving the effectiveness of donor-initiated water projects. In other words, a directional hypothesis signifies the direction in which the independent variable will affect the dependent variable. For instance, Somebody can say that class attendance will affect student performance. That one now is an unidirectional hypothesis. If you were to now formulate a directional hypothesis or one-tailed hypothesis out of that, then we would say that there will be greater student performance in examination with higher level of class attendance. The direction is clear. Which way the independent variable will affect the dependent variable is quite clear, and it is one direction. The direction here could be positive or it could be negative, but at least there is a direction. Let us now discuss some of the characteristics of a good hypothesis. One is the relevance. That is, a hypothesis should be relevant to the problem and inquiry, since it is not only used for the identification of the research problem, but also the solution of the problem. A good hypothesis should therefore be relevant to the techniques which are available for hypothesis testing, as well as related to a body of theory or theoretical orientation. If the hypothesis is related to some theory, research will help to qualify, support, correct, or refute the theory, since theory remains only relevant when supported by facts derived from hypothesis testing. So a hypothesis that a researcher comes up with must be that which is relevant to the research problem under inquiry, or to the issues under inquiries, so that at the end of the day, it is clear whether the data that has been collected supports the hypothesis or rejects the hypothesis. So relevance is a key element in hypothesis, and it is one of the indicators of good hypothesis. A good hypothesis should also be specific, and it is important to be specific and presented in a precise manner, since a hypothesis which is too general or too wide becomes quite difficult to test. Remember, at the end of the day, a hypothesis has to be tested, because the results of testing a hypothesis would either mean affirmation of that hypothesis or its rejection. So, but for us to do this, then we need a hypothesis that is quite specific to the issue. A hypothesis should therefore be based on precise and empirically testable concepts with clear indicators. Specificity in the formulation of a hypothesis ensures that the research problem is practicable and research findings verifiable. For example, a hypothesis that public participation is essential in the sustainability of development projects should enable us to define the concept of participation. The concept of participation should be unpacked in terms of level of participation, form of participation, and equality of participation. Otherwise, if we don't specify the parameters within which participation will be understood, then it becomes quite difficult to test the concept participation when we now want to test the hypothesis. So we have to be specific when we are coming up with hypotheses, so that terms and concepts that appear in the hypothesis must have a definite meaning, a definite explanation, and definite parameters within which they can be evaluated. They should not be general, because when they are too general, it becomes quite difficult to test. And by failing to test a hypothesis, then it becomes completely impossible to either accept or reject the hypothesis. The other important characteristic of good hypothesis is the testability. That is the ability to test it. And so a good hypothesis should be stated in such a way that it is possible to deduce logically certain inferences close to the level of concrete observation, so that they can be tested by observation in the field. The concepts embodied in the hypothesis must have clear empirical correspondence and should be explicitly defined so as to enable testing of that hypothesis. Hypothesis testing is important because it enables researchers to gauge whether empirical data collected using the entire research exercise supports the common knowledge or contradict what is known about those relationships. Thus, the analyzed and interpreted results of the data collected should either prove or disapprove the hypothesized outcome. In that case, a hypothesis should allow room for testing of the stated hypothesis once the results are analyzed. Again, I want to emphasize that one way through which testing of hypothesis is facilitated is through a clear definition of concepts, so that concepts are unpacked and specific meanings, the parameters and indicators assigned to them. When that is done, it then becomes easier for such terms to be regressed against others or correlated against others in the process of hypothesis testing. So testability of a hypothesis is one of the most important indicators of a hypothesis, because if we fail to test a hypothesis, like I noted earlier, it becomes quite impossible to say whether or not a hypothesis is accepted or it is rejected. The other important characteristic of a good hypothesis is to do with conceptual clarity. That is, a hypothesis should be simple, specific, and conceptually clear, since ambiguity makes the verification of a hypothesis quite difficult. Clarity of hypothesis is achieved through formal and operational definitions of key concepts in the hypothesis. Formal definition of the concepts will clarify what a particular concept stands for, while the operational definition gives the concept the indicators upon which it should be tested. An ambiguous hypothesis, which is characterized by undefined or ill-defined concepts, cannot be tested, since, understandably, there is no standard basis for knowing what observable facts would constitute during the test. In other words, we must define certain terms used in the hypothesis the way the study wants them understood. For instance, if we take the word, say, gender, we must clearly define how we want the term gender understood in the research. Does it mean male or female, or does it mean roles that are assigned to different sexes in society? That clarity becomes quite important. It is important in the sense that it will guide us in terms of the kind of data we collect, but again, it will also guide us in terms of the kind of hypothesis testing we take. And then at the end of the day, we will be in a position to either reject or accept the hypothesized statements that we made at the beginning of the study. That becomes the end of our discussion on the meaning, the types, and the characteristics of a hypothesis. Thank you so much for your time.